Your Honor, my name is Joshua, and I will be reading two statements today. I will be starting with Jessica's statement.
Can I ask your sister?
Correct. I love both of my parents so much. Although it may not have been the best way of raising us, I am glad that they did, because it made me the person I am today. I just want to thank them for teaching me about God and faith. I hope that they never lose their faith. I cannot describe in words what we went through growing up. Sometimes I still have nightmares of things that had happened, such as my siblings being chained up or getting beaten. But that is the past, and this is now. I love my parents and have forgiven them for a lot of the things
they lived in a house like any other. A quiet street. A neighborhood where no one asked too many questions. But inside, nothing was ordinary. Time had a different meaning. Days stretched into nights with no sense of change. Hunger was not just a feeling but a condition of existence. And silence. Silence was survival. In January 2018, everything changed. A single act of courage shattered the illusion. A girl, frail and terrified, stepped beyond the world she had always known and risked everything. For the first time in years, the truth was no longer locked away. David and Louise Turpin were parents, or at least, that's what they called themselves. To the outside world, they seemed devoted to their family. Smiling for cameras. Renewing their vows. Posting photos as if their lives were something to be envied. But behind closed doors, their children were captives. They were starving, isolated, and chained like prisoners. And for years, no one saw. No one stopped it. How does a crime this extreme remain hidden? How can 13 children suffer in plain sight? And once the truth is finally exposed, what happens next? This is the story of a family that fooled the world. And the system that failed them, even after they were free. Tonight, we uncover the reality of the Turpin case. The escape. The trial. The aftermath. And the lingering question that cannot be ignored: how many others are still waiting for someone to notice? But, before we go deeper into the story, we welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. It was still dark when she stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp against her skin. Her hands trembled, not from the chill, but from fear, fear of what might happen if she was caught, fear of what might happen if she failed. She had never done this before. The world beyond her home was foreign, unfamiliar. But she had no choice. 17-year-old Jordan Turpin had spent her life behind closed doors, hidden away like all her brothers and sisters. 13 children, trapped in a home that masqueraded as a place of love. They had never known freedom. Most had never felt the warmth of the sun on their skin for more than a moment, never spoken to strangers, never been allowed to exist beyond the walls that confined them. But on this night, Jordan was about to do the impossible. She ran. Stumbling at first, her body weak from years of starvation. Her arms were thin, her muscles barely strong enough to carry her forward. She clutched a deactivated cell phone, one she had stolen from her parents. It barely worked, but it was her only chance. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, planned her words, though she wasn't sure they would come out right. She had never spoken to a stranger before. Not once in her entire life. When she reached a safe distance, she dialed. The line connected. A voice answered. For a moment, she hesitated. What if she said too much? What if she said too little? But then, she forced herself to speak. Her words were barely above a whisper. She told them she had escaped. She told them about her family, her siblings. About the chains. About the hunger. About the punishments. She tried to explain how it had always been this way, how she didn't even know the word for the place they were in. The operator asked her where she was, but she didn't know. She had never been outside alone before. Everything was unfamiliar. But the voice on the other end didn't hang up. They stayed with her. They kept her talking, reassuring her that help was on the way. And help did come. But no one, not the officers, not the dispatchers, not even the neighbors who had lived just feet away, was prepared for what they were about to find. Minutes later, squad cars pulled up to a quiet suburban home. The house looked ordinary. Too ordinary. A well-kept lawn. A symmetrical driveway. Nothing about it hinted at what lay inside. But officers had heard enough from Jordan to know that appearances meant nothing. When they knocked on the door, there was no immediate response. Then, shuffling from inside. A delay. Officers exchanged glances. They knew that hesitation often meant someone inside was deciding what to do next. Then, the door creaked open. Louise Turpin stood there. Her face a careful mask of confusion, her voice sweet but unsure, as though she had just woken up and didn't understand why police were standing on her doorstep. She smiled. An expression that would have seemed warm if the officers hadn't already known what they knew. One officer asked if they could step inside. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. And then she nodded, stepping aside. The door swung open. The first thing they noticed was the smell. A thick, stagnant odor that clung to the air. A mix of decay, filth, and something worse, something human. The second thing was the silence. A house with 13 children should have been filled with movement, with life. But it wasn't. The officers stepped forward cautiously, their eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The furniture was sparse, worn down. The floors were stained. The air was heavy, suffocating. And then, movement. From the shadows, figures emerged. Small. Fragile. Eyes wide, hollow, reflecting something beyond mere fear. The officers hesitated. These were not the children they had expected. They were too small, too thin. Their skin was pale, almost translucent. Hair tangled. Clothes stiff with dirt and waste. They did not run to the officers. They did not cry out for help. They simply stood there, unmoving, waiting. As if they were unsure whether they were allowed to react at all. One of the officers spoke softly. He asked their names. No one answered. A little girl raised her hand in a hesitant wave, as if greeting someone for the first time. And in many ways, she was. Then, in the dim light, they saw something else. Shackles. Bolted to the bed frame. Chains wrapped tightly around wrists, ankles. And in those chains, 2 children. They did not scream. They did not fight. They simply watched, silent, their eyes reflecting the flashing red and blue lights outside. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the officers, trained for the worst, were motionless. What they were seeing was not just neglect. It was not just cruelty. It was something far beyond what they had ever encountered. And then, the silence broke. One officer radioed for backup. Another stepped forward, kneeling beside one of the chained children. Gently, cautiously, he reached out. The child flinched. This was the moment the world would later see. The moment they would read about in headlines, hear about on the news. The moment people would gasp at and shake their heads in disbelief. But for these children, it was just another night in a life they had always known. A life they never thought they would escape. One of the children, barely strong enough to lift her arm, pointed towards a closed door down the hall. An officer stepped toward it. The knob turned with resistance. He pushed. The door opened. Inside, they found more. More children. More faces with the same expression, blank, waiting, uncertain. And then, something else. A notebook. Open, filled with words scrawled in small, desperate handwriting. A record of everything. Of what had happened. Of what had been done to them. A record that no one had ever seen. Until now. The officers did not know it then, but this was only the beginning. What they had uncovered in that house would shock the world. But what came after, the trial, the so-called justice system, the promises that were made, would lead to even more questions. And some of those questions remain unanswered to this day. The Turpin children had been rescued. But were they ever truly free? There are places where time stands still. Places where silence becomes a language of survival. Where the walls hold secrets so unthinkable that even those who lived within them struggled to understand what life was supposed to be beyond their reach. The house on Muir Woods Road was one of those places. To the outside world, it was nothing more than an ordinary home. But inside, it was something else entirely. The officers moved through the room slowly, carefully. Each step revealing something worse than the last. The air was thick, stagnant, suffocating. It smelled of decay, of filth that had been left untouched for years. The floors were coated in grime, the furniture stained beyond recognition. The windows were covered, no sunlight, no fresh air. The walls, once white, had faded into a color that no longer resembled anything clean. The children stood motionless, their expressions unreadable. Some covered their faces as though the presence of strangers was too much to process. Others looked toward the ground, unable to meet the eyes of those who had come to save them. They were not just malnourished, they were skeletal. Their arms were thin, barely able to hold their own weight. Their skin was pale, clinging tightly to their bones. Their hair was brittle, some patches missing entirely. And then, there were their eyes. Hollow, distant, yet filled with something even more disturbing than fear, acceptance. As if this existence, this reality, was the only one they had ever known. The officers counted them, one by one. 13. Some adults, yet trapped in bodies that looked years younger. Malnutrition had stunted their growth. The younger ones should have been full of life, full of energy. Instead, they barely moved. Some swayed where they stood, weak, struggling to keep themselves upright. Then came the chains. Heavy. Cold. Bolted to beds. Wrapped around wrists and ankles. The children had been restrained for so long that their skin had bruised beneath the weight of the metal. Some still bore open sores, raw from the friction. Others had scars, evidence of how many times this had happened before. The officers worked quickly to remove them, but even as the locks clicked open, the children did not run. They did not fight. They simply stood there, waiting for permission to move. In the corner of one room, a bucket sat filled with human waste. There was no plumbing, no working toilet for them to use. The walls were smeared with dirt, with handprints, as if the children had tried to steady themselves in moments of weakness. The smell was overpowering. It was not the kind of filth that came from neglect alone, it was the kind that spoke of captivity, of time passing without change, of suffering that had no end in sight. In another room, there were beds, but no blankets. No pillows. Just stiff, stained mattresses pressed against the walls. Some had ropes still attached to the bedposts, as if they had been used before the chains. The children were allowed to sleep, but only when their parents decided they had earned it. The kitchen told its own story. There was food, canned goods, expired snacks, untouched. A refrigerator stocked with fresh meals. But none of it was for the children. It was for David and Louise Turpin. The children were fed rarely, and when they were, it was in portions too small to sustain them. Moldy bread. Spoonfuls of peanut butter. Rotten vegetables. They were forbidden from drinking too much water, even though their bodies cried out for it. They had learned not to ask for more. Bathing was a privilege, one that came maybe once a year. Their clothes were stiff, unwashed, covered in stains that had settled into the fabric like a second skin. They smelled of sweat, of urine, of neglect that had never been interrupted. And yet, the house had decorations. Family photos. Smiling faces frozen in time. David and Louise Turpin standing at the center, their children surrounding them in a carefully constructed image of happiness. But those who stood in front of the camera were not the same children the officers saw that night. They had been forced to smile. Forced to pretend. Forced to uphold an illusion that had hidden the truth for far too long. The officers continued their search, trying to understand how something like this could go unnoticed. How 13 children could be suffering behind these walls, and no one had intervened. Then, they found the journals. Hundreds of pages, written in small, desperate handwriting. The children had kept records, of what happened to them, of when they were last fed, of when they were last allowed to see daylight. They had documented their own suffering, as if they knew that one day, someone might finally read their words. David and Louise Turpin did not just control their children's bodies, they controlled their minds. They dictated when they could eat, when they could sleep, when they could speak. They stripped them of their names, reducing them to nothing more than subjects under their rule. They withheld education, keeping them unknowing, unable to reach out for help. They told them that the outside world was dangerous. That if they ever tried to leave, they would be taken, separated, hurt. They made them believe that their suffering was normal. Punishments were severe. If one child disobeyed, the others paid the price. They were forced to watch as their siblings were beaten, as they cried out for mercy that never came. They were shackled for weeks, unable to move, unable to stretch their legs. They were locked in rooms without light, left in silence so crushing that even the sound of their own breathing felt like too much. They were never allowed to speak to one another without permission. Laughter was a crime. Comfort was forbidden. If one of them tried to soothe another, they were punished for it. There was no sense of safety, no moment of relief. Even when authorities arrived, some of the children still flinched at every movement, waiting for the consequences they had always been taught to expect. It would take time, years, for them to fully grasp that the rules had changed. That their parents no longer held power over them. That for the first time in their lives, they were free. But what does freedom mean to someone who has never known it? For the Turpin children, rescue was only the beginning. The world outside those walls was just as unfamiliar as the world inside had once been, and as they stepped beyond their home for the first time, they had no way of knowing that the fight for their survival was far from over. They had escaped their parents. But had they truly escaped the system? To understand what happened inside the Turpin home, we have to go back, to where it all began. Before the chains. Before the starvation. Before the deception that fooled an entire community. Before they were parents, David and Louise were simply two people from small-town America. Their story started like any other. Ordinary. Unremarkable. But something within their world set them on a path that would eventually lead to unimaginable cruelty. David Allen Turpin was born in 1961 in Princeton, West Virginia. His upbringing was traditional, shaped by the rigid values of a deeply religious family. Rules were strict. Expectations were clear. Life was built around faith, obedience, and structure. From an early age, he was known for his intelligence, excelling in school, particularly in math and science. He was quiet, reserved, a boy who followed the rules, who stayed within the boundaries set before him. Then there was Louise Anna Turpin, born in 1968 in the same state. The youngest of 6 siblings, she, too, grew up in a conservative, religious household. Her family followed strict Pentecostal teachings. Modesty. Submission. The belief that women were to serve their husbands, that marriage was sacred, and that children were blessings meant to be multiplied. These were the lessons ingrained in her from the beginning. But within her childhood, there were whispers of something else. Stories from her relatives suggested an upbringing laced with control, manipulation, and something darker, things that would only come to light years later. David and Louise met when she was just 16. He was 23. Their connection was immediate, and in many ways, predictable. He was drawn to her innocence, her devotion, her unwavering belief in faith and family. She saw him as her escape, a man who could offer her a new life, away from the confines of her childhood home. Against her parents' wishes, she ran away with him. They married in 1985, with Louise barely out of high school. She was young, eager to be a wife. He was older, methodical, already set in his ways. Together, they would build a life, one that, on the surface, mirrored the very values they had both been raised to follow. But marriage was not a partnership for them. It was an extension of control. And over time, that control would expand, not just over Louise, but over every child they brought into the world. At first, they lived like any young couple. David secured a job as an engineer, working for Lockheed Martin and later Northrop Grumman, companies that valued his intelligence and methodical thinking. Louise stayed home, embracing the role of wife, and soon, mother. Their first child was born in the late 1980s, followed by another, and another. The family grew, and with it, the rules within their home became stricter. Louise, once outgoing and social, withdrew from the outside world. David, once simply a man of discipline, became something else entirely. They adhered to a belief system that reinforced their choices, the quiverful movement. A fundamentalist ideology that encouraged large families, strict obedience, and absolute parental authority. To them, children were not just individuals, they were extensions of their faith, meant to be molded, shaped, controlled. David took this literally. He believed in discipline, in total submission, in an environment where he dictated every moment of his children's lives. The more children they had, the more extreme their rules became. They stopped attending church regularly, choosing instead to practice their faith in isolation. They pulled their children from traditional schools, opting for homeschooling. But it wasn't education. There were no lessons, no books, no structure. The children were not taught to think. They were taught to obey. By the time they left Texas in 2010, the family was already slipping from public view. There were whispers among extended relatives, concerns about how thin the children looked, how they never spoke unless prompted, how they avoided eye contact. But David and Louise had perfected the art of explanation. They were homeschooling. They were raising their family with strong values. They were simply private people who believed in doing things their own way. And for most, that was enough. But Texas had cracks in the illusion. The home they left behind was later found in ruins, filthy, abandoned, reeking of neglect. Neighbors who had rarely seen the children began questioning why. But by then, the Tuppins were already gone. California was supposed to be a fresh start. A new home. A new community, a place where they could continue their lives without scrutiny. But instead of blending in, they disappeared completely. The new house in Paris was bigger, but it was not a home. It was a cage. The children, once allowed brief moments of normalcy, were now completely shut away. The rules tightened. The punishments escalated. The doors locked. David and Louise crafted an illusion so carefully that even those who lived just feet away never questioned it. The front yard was clean. The blinds were drawn. They emerged only when necessary, smiling, polite, keeping their interactions brief. When they did speak to neighbors, it was always with carefully chosen words. They were a large family, but they managed just fine. The children were homeschooled. They were well behaved. Everything was under control. And in a way, it was. But control was not care. Control was not love. Control was not protection. It was something else entirely. It was the reason 13 children lived without sunlight, without nourishment, without dignity. It was the reason they flinched at sudden movements, why they whispered instead of spoke, why they feared asking for more. For years, this illusion held. The children were trained to play their roles when necessary. To smile when visitors came. To say only what they were told to say. To never ask for help. Because asking for help meant consequences. And consequences were brutal. There were no birthday parties. No school plays. No outings with friends. No phone calls. No letters. No contact with the outside world beyond what David and Louise allowed. Their lives were controlled down to the second, their every move monitored, their every word weighed. And no one, no teacher, no neighbor, no distant relative, ever broke through that wall of silence. But silence does not last forever. Fear may keep a person still, but it cannot erase the instinct to survive. And for one of the Turpin children, that instinct was stronger than the years of control that had shaped her world. The night she stepped out of that house, she shattered everything David and Louise had spent decades building. The illusion was over. And soon, the world would finally see what had been hidden behind closed doors for so long. Control is easiest to maintain when nothing changes. As long as the Turpin household remained sealed off from the rest of the world, David and Louise could dictate every moment, every word, every breath. But life, even under the tightest grip, has a way of shifting. And for the Turpins, the cracks in their carefully constructed world were beginning to show. David Turpin had always presented himself as a man of stability. A provider. A professional. For years, he worked as an engineer, earning a substantial income. But maintaining an illusion, especially one built on excess, comes at a cost. 13 children. A large home. Frequent moves. The mounting expenses of a family that was growing larger by the year. And behind the smiles, behind the carefully staged photographs, the financial weight of their choices was pulling them under. In 2011, David filed for bankruptcy. The debt had piled too high, the resources stretched too thin. He listed an income of over $140,000 a year. On paper, it was a comfortable salary. But the reality was different. Their debt exceeded their ability to keep up. The cracks in their foundation were no longer invisible. And while most families would cut back, adjust, seek solutions, David and Louise did something else. They withdrew further. They tightened their grip. And most of all, they made sure their children suffered the consequences. Food became more restricted. They had enough money to feed them, but they chose not to. Instead, they let their children waste away while they continued spending on themselves. They went on vacations. They dined out. They took road trips to Las Vegas, renewing their vows in front of Elvis impersonators, while their children sat locked away at home, waiting for scraps. Education, already non-existent, became even more of a formality. The children were officially registered as students under the Sandcastle Day School, a homeschooling program created solely for their household. But it was nothing more than a name on paper. There were no lessons. No assignments. No future being built for them. Only a void. An existence that led nowhere. David still had a job, but his presence in the outside world grew smaller. He stopped attending work functions, avoided social interactions. Louise became even more reclusive. She cut ties with extended family, refusing visits, ignoring concerns. The house, already a prison, became something worse. A place where the rules were absolute, and questioning them was not an option. With every passing year, their world grew smaller. And yet, within those walls, there were voices that refused to be silenced forever. For the Turpin children, life had always been dictated by fear. The punishments were swift, brutal, relentless. Disobedience was not an option. And yet, some of them had tried. Some of them had dared to reach beyond the boundaries their parents had set. One of the oldest daughters once found the courage to escape. She managed to slip outside, to taste the air beyond the suffocating space she had always known. She ran, her heart pounding, her legs weak from years of malnourishment. She made it no further than the front yard before Louise caught her. There was no mercy. She was dragged back inside. And what followed was worse than any punishment she had endured before. Her parents made an example of her. For days, she was beaten, chained, left in a room alone with no food, no water. The lesson was clear: escape was impossible. And if anyone else tried, they would suffer the same fate. Another time, one of the younger boys was caught whispering to a sibling about leaving. He had never stepped beyond the walls alone, never even walked down the street without permission. But the idea had been growing in his mind, the thought that there had to be something else, something beyond the world they had been forced to accept. David overheard. The boy was shackled for weeks, left in a dark room until he no longer spoke of such things. Then there was the internet. A window to the outside world, one that David and Louise had not considered to be a threat at first. They allowed their children to watch videos, to listen to music. But what they did not realize was that, in small, quiet moments, some of them had begun to learn. They had seen what other lives looked like. They had heard voices beyond their own. And, slowly, the idea formed: what if they could leave? What if they could be like the people they saw in those videos? Jordan, the daughter who would eventually escape, was among the first to start questioning everything. She had watched the outside world through a screen, had seen people living freely, had realized that what she was experiencing was not normal. And she was not alone. Some of her siblings had begun keeping records, writing down their thoughts, their experiences, as if preparing for a future where someone might finally read them. But hope was a fragile thing. They had learned to be careful, to hide their thoughts, to never let their parents suspect. Because if they did, the punishment would be severe. And so, for years, they waited. Until one night, Jordan could wait no longer. She took the phone. She stepped outside. And she ran. That night was not just the end of their captivity. It was the beginning of something else entirely. A reckoning. A trial that would expose everything David and Louise had worked so hard to hide. And for the first time, the world would hear the voices that had been silenced for far too long. The moment the door to the Turpin house swung open, everything David and Louise had built, their secrecy, their control, their iron grip over their children, collapsed. The years of silence, the punishments, the starvation, the fear, it had all led to this. Officers stood frozen, taking in the sight of what should have been a home but instead looked like a place where time had stopped. A house filled with children who barely looked like children at all, eyes wide and hollow, bodies weak and trembling. But the worst part wasn't the filth or the chains or the buckets used as toilets. The worst part was the way they reacted to help. Or rather, how they didn't. They didn't cry. They didn't beg. They didn't run into the arms of the officers who had come to save them. Because they didn't know if they were allowed to. The rescue was swift, but the shockwaves had only just begun. That night, as David and Louise Turpin were led from their home in handcuffs, the cameras flashed. The world was waking up to a horror that had been hidden in plain sight. The charges came quickly. 12 counts of torture. 12 counts of false imprisonment. 7 counts of abuse of a dependent adult. 6 counts of child abuse. And, for David, an additional charge of committing a lewd act on a child. The words alone were damning, but the reality behind them was worse. In the days following the arrest, investigators pieced together the full scale of the cruelty. The interviews with the children, the notes found inside the house, the photographs taken as evidence, every detail painted a picture that was nearly impossible to comprehend. 13 children, some of them legally adults, had spent their entire lives imprisoned. Starved, shackled, beaten. Their growth stunted, their minds developmentally delayed from years of neglect. Some of them didn't even know what a police officer was. Others couldn't spell their own names. And all of them, every single one, had been conditioned to believe that their suffering was normal. The community was in disbelief. Neighbors who had never questioned the shuttered windows, the late-night movements, the pale faces that sometimes appeared for only seconds at a time. Teachers who had noticed odd behaviors in the older Turpin children but never pushed hard enough to intervene. Family members who had once been close but had slowly been cut off, forced to accept vague excuses about homeschooling in privacy. And now, every single one of them was left wondering the same thing: how did no one stop this? But there was no time for reflection. The case was moving forward, and David and Louise Turpin, the couple who had hidden their cruelty behind a carefully constructed image of faith and family, were about to face justice. The trial was one of the most anticipated in recent memory. The media swarmed outside the courthouse, cameras waiting for a glimpse of the parents who had become symbols of unspeakable cruelty. When David and Louise were led inside, they looked almost ordinary. David, still in his glasses, his hair thinning. Louise, disheveled, her once carefully maintained appearance now replaced by something vacant, empty. They did not speak. They did not cry. They did not apologize. They simply sat, listening as their crimes were laid bare for the world to hear. The prosecution presented the evidence with unflinching precision. They showed images from inside the house. The shackles. The stained mattresses. The empty refrigerator stocked only with food for the parents while the children wasted away. They played recordings from interviews with the Turpin children, their voices small, hesitant, as they described the punishments. If we washed our hands above the wrist, we got beaten. If we took food without permission, we got beaten. If we spoke when we weren't supposed to, we got beaten. They told the court about nights spent awake, listening to the sound of their own stomachs crying out for food. About birthdays that went unnoticed. About dreams of escape that were met with chains instead. And then, there were the statements. One by one, the children, the survivors, stood before the court, facing the people who had stolen their childhoods. Some were still too afraid to speak, their words written down instead, read aloud by representatives, but others found their voices. One of the daughters, now an adult, stood trembling but defiant. My parents took my whole life from me. But now, I am taking it back. Her voice shook, but she did not falter. I am free. And I will never let anyone take that from me again. Jordan, the girl who had saved them all, also spoke. I thought I would die that night. I thought if they caught me, I would never see the outside again. But I had to try. I had to. She described how she had rehearsed her 911 call, whispering the words over and over to herself in the dark, terrified that she wouldn't be able to say them when the time came. We weren't just abused. We were manipulated. We were taught to be afraid of the world. But now, I know the world isn't what they said it was. The world is helping us. Some of the children, still too conditioned by years of control, could not bring themselves to condemn their parents. They had been trained to love them, to obey them. And in some twisted way, they still did, but even in their hesitation, their testimonies spoke volumes. When it came time for the verdict, there was no suspense. The evidence was overwhelming. The suffering undeniable. The jury had heard enough. And so, the sentence was delivered. Life in prison. Both David and Louise. 25 years before the possibility of parole. But even as the sentence was handed down, the question remained, was it enough? Could there ever be enough justice for what had been done? For some, it was a victory. A moment where the system had done what it was supposed to do. For others, it felt incomplete. Because even though the Turpin children were now free, their struggles were far from over. The road to healing would be long. And the world outside the walls of their prison, though filled with promise, would not always be kind. The courtroom emptied. The cameras moved on. And the Turpins, the parents who had once controlled everything, were led away, their futures no longer in their hands. But this was not the end of the story. Because as the world would soon learn, freedom did not guarantee safety, and for the Turpin children, the real battle had only just begun. For years, they had only known one world, a world where freedom was an illusion, where pain was routine, where speaking without permission was a crime. And now, they were expected to step into something entirely new. The outside world. A place they had seen only through television screens, glimpsed through cracks in the blinds. A place that was both full of possibility, and terrifyingly unfamiliar. At first, it seemed like hope had finally arrived. Donations poured in, hundreds of thousands of dollars raised by strangers who wanted to help. Officials made promises. These children would be cared for, protected, given the resources they had been denied their entire lives. The system, they said, would not fail them again. But promises do not always translate into reality. The younger Turpin children were placed into foster care, separated but given what was supposed to be safety. Yet safety, as they quickly learned, was not guaranteed. They had already survived one form of captivity. What they could not have expected was that they would walk into another. In 2021, reports emerged that some of the Turpin children had been placed in an abusive foster home. The details were hauntingly familiar. The foster parents, who had been trusted with some of the most vulnerable children in the country, were later charged with child abuse, false imprisonment, and cruelty. They had done what David and Louise had done before them, starved, isolated, and tormented those who had already suffered more than most could imagine. It was a betrayal beyond comprehension. These children, who had once been chained to beds, who had been forced to beg for food, were now enduring mistreatment once again, this time under the watch of the very system meant to protect them. One of the Turpin children, after years of silence, spoke out about what had happened. "I was placed with another monster." The words cut through everything. A plea that should never have had to be made. A reminder that escape from one nightmare did not guarantee safety from another. A lawsuit was filed. The county, Riverside, the same county that had promised justice, was accused of negligence, of failing to oversee the very system they claimed would heal these children. The foster parents responsible were arrested. But the damage had already been done. The system had failed them. Again. Now, for the older Turpin children, the transition was equally difficult. They had aged out of foster care, but they were not equipped for the world beyond it. They had been denied education. Denied basic social interaction. Denied the ability to navigate even the simplest tasks of daily life. Some of them tried to start over, enrolling in school for the first time, learning how to do things most take for granted, how to grocery shop, how to use a bank, how to make their own choices. But the weight of their past was not so easy to shed. There were setbacks. Some struggled with homelessness. Others found themselves manipulated again, taken advantage of by people who saw their vulnerability and exploited it. For children who had never been allowed to make decisions, trusting the wrong person was easy. And in the real world, there were consequences for misplaced trust. The money raised for them, the donations from people who had wanted to help, was supposed to be a safety net. A resource to ensure they never suffered again. But it did not reach them the way it should have. Bureaucracy. Red tape. Legal complications. Whatever the reason, some of the Turpin children found themselves struggling despite the financial support that had been promised. But even in the face of these challenges, they did not remain silent. They had been taught to obey, but they had also learned how to fight. Some of them stepped forward, speaking publicly about their experiences. About what had happened to them inside their home. About what had happened to them after. People think the story ended when we were rescued. But for us, it was just the beginning. They shared their struggles, their triumphs, their attempts to navigate a world that had only recently acknowledged their existence. And they were not alone. There were those who listened. Those who refused to let them slip through the cracks again. People like Tyler Perry, who stepped in to ensure that some of the Turpin children had safe housing, had resources, had guidance. People who heard their voices and responded, not with sympathy, but with action. And slowly, they began to build lives of their own. One of the daughters enrolled in college. Something she had never thought possible. Another found employment, learning what it meant to work, to contribute, to exist as her own person rather than as an extension of someone else's control. Some of them embraced their new freedom with open arms. Others struggled to adjust, their past still weighing on them, shaping them. But through it all, they moved forward. They were no longer just survivors. They were something more. They were people who had been pushed to the edge of existence and had fought their way back. But even as they continued their journey, the question remained. The question that haunted every aspect of their story. Did the system fail them? Not just once, but again and again. It had failed to see them when they were suffering inside that house. It had failed to protect them from further harm once they were free. And now, as they tried to carve out a future, it was still failing to ensure they had what they needed to truly begin again. The case of David and Louise Turpin was not just a story of cruelty. It was not just about one family's horror. It was a reflection of something larger. A system that does not always protect the most vulnerable. A legal structure that often offers punishment, but not rehabilitation. A world that, despite all its resources, still allows suffering to go unnoticed. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is not what happened to the Turpin children, but how many others might still be waiting, silent, unseen, forgotten, just like they once were. For years, the Turpin children lived in silence. A silence that was not their choice, but one that had been forced upon them. They were taught that their suffering was normal, that obedience was survival, that hope was a lie. But when Jordan Turpin stepped outside that night, when she lifted the phone with trembling hands and spoke to a voice she had never met, she did something her parents never expected. She changed the course of their lives forever. What followed was a rescue that should have been the end of their nightmare. A moment that should have marked the beginning of something new. And in some ways, it did. The shackles were gone. The doors were no longer locked. They could speak, move, choose. But the weight of their past was not so easily cast aside. Freedom, they learned, was not immediate. It was not a switch that could be flipped. It was something that had to be fought for every day. And the world beyond their prison was far more complicated than they had imagined. Some of them flourished. They went to school, for the first time in their lives, sitting in classrooms where knowledge was no longer forbidden. They learned to read, to write, to express themselves. They discovered music, friendships, laughter, things that had once seemed impossible. They stepped onto college campuses, found jobs, built new lives from the ground up. But for others, the scars of their past ran too deep. They struggled to trust, to connect, to believe in a future where cruelty did not follow them. They found themselves lost in a world that had never been prepared for them. Some ended up homeless, despite the money raised in their name. Some were placed in foster homes where the abuse continued, hidden beneath a different mask. And some simply disappeared from the public eye, retreating into the only defense they had ever known, silence. They had survived their parents. But they were still fighting to survive the system. Their journey is not one of a perfect ending. It is not a story wrapped up neatly with justice served and lives instantly rebuilt. It is a reminder that survival is not the same as healing. That escape is not the same as recovery. That being free does not always mean being safe. And perhaps most importantly, it is a reminder that for every Turpin child who was found, there are others who are still waiting. Waiting behind locked doors. Waiting in homes that look normal from the outside. Waiting in silence, convinced that no one will ever come for them. The Turpin case forced the world to see what was hidden behind one set of walls. But how many other walls still remain closed? We like to believe that if we had been there, we would have seen the signs. That we would have questioned the closed blinds, the skeletal figures glimpsed through windows, the way the Turpin children walked in perfect, obedient silence. That we would have asked the right questions, made the right calls, done something before it was too late. But the truth is, the signs were always there. The warning signals were flashing long before that night in 2018. The system failed them. The world failed them. And now, as we look back, the only question that remains is whether we will fail others the same way. If you suspect abuse, if you see something that doesn't sit right, if a child seems afraid to speak, if their presence is more absence than life, say something. Ask questions. Make the call. It is better to be wrong than to stay silent. The Turpin children are proof of what can happen when no one speaks up. And their survival is proof of what can happen when someone finally does. Do you believe the legal system protected them? Or do you think it failed them again, even after their rescue? What changes do you think should be made to prevent this from happening to others? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Because silence should never be the answer. Don't forget to like this video, comment and subscribe to the channel.